The silence was the first betrayal. It was a living thing in the obsidian palace, a creature that coiled in the long, vaulted corridors and slept in the hollows of the king's unsmiling mouth. For 6 months, Elara had learned the language of it, the specific timbre of the silence that followed a courtier's whispered jest at her expense, the heavy, waiting silence that fell when she entered a room, the brittle, sharp silence from the throne whenever she dared to meet King Valerus's gaze. He never spoke, not in her defense. He never moved. He simply watched, his eyes the color of a winter night, as his court slowly, meticulously, artfully, picked her apart. Tonight, the silence was different. It was her own. A silence she was building, brick by painful brick, around the frantic hammering of her own heart. She stood before the tall, silvered glass in her chambers, a room draped in silks the color of bruises and blood. The reflection was a stranger, a pale, haunted thing with eyes too large for her face, her human fragility thrown into stark relief by the eternal, predatory beauty of the palace. They had called her the king's pet. The little mortal novelty. Her hands, which trembled as she fastened the last button on a plain woolen tunic, were not made for this world of cold marble and colder immortality. They were made for kneading dough, for holding a warm mug, for tending to living things. And she was tending to a living thing. A secret, precious and terrifying, that she had guarded for 7 months with the ferocity of a dragon. She pressed a hand to the gentle swell of her belly, hidden beneath the drab, borrowed clothes of a scullery maid. A flutter, a tiny, insistent kick, a promise of a life that would never know the crushing weight of this court's contempt. This was not just her heir. This was his heir. The son of the vampire king who sat on his throne and watched her drown in silence. The irony was a blade twisting in her gut. He, who had a kingdom that would never die, was about to lose the only part of him that was truly alive. The plan was a desperate, flimsy thing, woven from whispers and shadows. It relied on a single kindness from a kitchen girl named Lyra, whose brother Elara had nursed through a fever. It relied on the arrogance of the court, their certainty that a human was as helpless as she was worthless. It relied on the king's monumental indifference. He had not come to her chambers in 3 weeks. Before that, his visits had been brief, formal, almost clinical. He would stand by the window, a silhouette against the perpetual twilight of his kingdom, and speak of treaties and bloodlines, never of the chasm of silence that grew between them. He had taken her to his bed, given her a child, and then left her to the wolves. She pulled the rough hood over her head, obscuring the pale gold of her hair, the one feature the court poets had sometimes praised with cruel, flowery verse. Her treasured possessions were few. A small, carved wooden bird her father had made her, and a single, perfect obsidian scale that had fallen from Valerus's ceremonial armor the first night he had brought her here. She had kept it, a foolish, hopeful token. She left it now on the center of the vast, cold bed. A final, silent word in a conversation he had never allowed to begin. Let him find it. Let him wonder. The corridors were empty, as she knew they would be. The court was in the grand hall, engaged in their nightly rituals of power and veiled cruelty. The air thrummed with the distant, dissonant music of a string quartet, a sound that had once seemed beautiful and now felt like a dirge. Lyra was waiting, as promised, by the service entrance to the kitchens, her face a pale moon in the gloom. She held a bundle of bread and dried meat, her eyes wide with a fear that was entirely for Elara's sake. The western gate, Lyra whispered, her breath misting in the chill air. Old Thomas is on duty. He's half-blind and mostly deaf. Go now. Don't run until you're past the outer ward. Elara's hands met Lyra's, a brief, desperate press of flesh. I have nothing to give you, Elara murmured, her voice thick. It was the first time she had spoken in hours, and the sound was raw, foreign. You gave my brother back to me, Lyra said, her loyalty a small, warm light in the suffocating darkness. That is enough. Go. May the old gods of the sun watch over you. The sun. Elara had almost forgotten it. Here, in the heart of the Nocturne Kingdom, the sky was a permanent canvas of bruised twilight, the moon a shard of bone. The thought of sunlight, real and warm and unapologetic, was a prayer. She turned, the bundle clutched to her chest, and slipped into the labyrinthine service tunnels. The smell of old stone and damp earth replaced the cloying scent of blood wine and wilting funeral lilies that permeated the palace. Down here, the silence was different. It was not a weapon. It was a blanket. A shield. Each step was a lifetime. Each drip of water from the ceiling a crack of thunder in her ears. Her body, heavy with new life, ached in protest. She thought of Valerus, a fleeting, painful image. His face, carved from alabaster and shadow, the way his long, dark hair fell across his brow. She remembered the startling warmth of his hand the first time he had touched her, a warmth that had promised a haven and delivered a gilded cage. Had any of it been real? The quiet moments, the shared books, the way he had once traced the line of her jaw with a tenderness that had stolen her breath. Or was it all part of the grand, cruel theatre of his court? She reached the western gate. It was a minor exit, used for supply carts and servants. A single, ancient vampire slumped on a stool, his head nodding toward his chest. Old Thomas. Ilara lowered her head, her face deep in the shadow of her hood, and walked. She did not run. She did not hurry. She moved with the shuffling gait of a servant weary after a long shift. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. 10 paces. 20. The gate was behind her. The cold, clean air of the mountains filled her lungs, sharp and intoxicating. She was in the outer ward. And then, she ran. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs screamed, away from the silence and the shadows, toward a sun she could only imagine, with the king's living heart beating safely beneath her own. For 2 days, the obsidian scale lay on the unrumpled silk of the royal bed. For 2 days, the king did not enter his consort's chambers. He was occupied with matters of state, a territorial dispute with the southern wolf clans, a failing blood tithe from a human principality. He moved through his duties with the same chilling, dispassionate grace he moved through eternity. His court orbited him, their whispers and schemes the grinding of the celestial spheres. They noted Ilara's absence from the evening meal, from the morning's silent audiences. Her absence was a small, satisfying victory for them. The little human bird was sulking in her cage. Perhaps the king was finally tiring of his novelty. Lady Serafina, her fangs like polished daggers and her ambition a palpable force, positioned herself closer to the throne, her crimson gown a slash against the black marble. Valerus noticed Ilara's absence, of course. He noticed everything. It was a small, quiet space in the vast tapestry of his awareness, but it was there. He had given her this time, this distance. He had believed it was a kindness. A space for her to acclimate, to grow a thicker skin. He had seen the court's barbs, heard the veiled insults. He had seen them as trials by fire, the necessary, painful forging of a human soul into something that could withstand an immortal court. He had expected her to bend, perhaps, but never to break. He had underestimated the relentless, grinding pressure of their contempt. He had overestimated his own passive protection. He had thought his possession of her was shield enough. He had been a fool. On the third night, a strange disquiet settled over him. A thread was loose in the perfect, cold order of his world. He concluded his audience, dismissing the fawning courtiers with a flick of his fingers, and walked the silent corridors toward her wing of the palace. The 2 guards at her door, hulking brutes named Cassian and Marius, bowed low. They had not seen her. They had assumed she was unwell. Their purpose was to keep others out, not to keep her in. The thought had never occurred to any of them that she might want to leave. Where would she go? Back to her sun-drenched, short-lived world of rot and decay? He pushed open the heavy doors. The silence that met him was not the silence of sleep. It was the silence of abandonment. The air was still, cold, holding the faint, fading scent of her chamomile and sunlight and something uniquely, mortally warm. The room was immaculate, her few possessions arranged with a precision that screamed of departure. And on the bed, a single, dark speck on the sea of silver silk, was the obsidian scale from his armor. He picked it up. It was cool against his skin, a piece of himself that he had not even realized was missing. He remembered the night it had fallen. Their first night. He had been removing the heavy, ceremonial plate, and she had watched him, her eyes filled not with fear, as he'd expected, but with a quiet, unnerving curiosity. He had felt, for the first time in centuries, seen. Not as a king, not as a predator, but as a man. He had let the scale lie where it fell. He turned, his senses expanding, sweeping through the castle. Her scent was a ghost trail, leading down through the service tunnels, growing fainter and fainter until it mingled with the 1,000 other smells of the lower wards, and then, it vanished at the western gate. He was there in an instant, a whisper of shadow and fury. Old Thomas, roused from his stupor by the king's terrifying presence, could only stammer about a kitchen girl leaving her shift. Valerus returned to her rooms, the scale now clenched in his fist so tightly its sharp edges dug into his palm. Something was wrong. This was not the act of a sulking consort. This was an escape. A desperate, calculated flight. But why? The court was cruel, yes, but he had given her luxury, safety from the outside world, the promise of a life untouched by age or disease. What could have driven her to trade that for the wilderness? His gaze fell upon her wardrobe. He swept the doors open. Silks and velvets hung in perfect order. But in the back, behind a row of gowns, was a small, empty space. A servant's dress was missing. And something else. A small wooden chest where she kept her personal tinctures and remedies was ajar. Inside, among the dried herbs, was a small, folded swatch of linen. He picked it up. It was a birthing cloth, intricately embroidered with protective runes. He had seen them before in the human villages his legions had pacified. A cloth for a newborn. The world tilted. The silence of the room became a roar in his ears. A child. His child. A truth so immense, so impossible, it had been completely invisible to him. He replayed the last few months in his mind. Her weariness, which he had mistaken for melancholy. The way she had begun to wear looser gowns, a change he had barely registered. The protective way she rested her hands on her stomach. All the signs had been there, a language he had not known how to read. She had been carrying his heir, the first true-born vampire prince in 1,000 years, and she had been doing it alone, in a court of smiling assassins. The cold dread that had been gathering in his chest solidified into something dense and heavy, a core of absolute zero. He had not just failed her. He had committed a sin of negligence so profound it bordered on monstrous. He had left the mother of his son, the future of his entire race, to the mercy of his enemies, while he sat on his throne and called his inaction wisdom. He crushed the obsidian scale in his fist, the sharp fragments grinding into his flesh. The pain was nothing. A distant, irrelevant flicker. He strode from the room, his long coat sweeping behind him like the wings of a vengeful god. The palace, which had been sleeping in its arrogant stillness, felt the shift in its master. A tremor of pure, cold rage that vibrated through the very stones. The guards in the hall flinched back from the look in his eyes. "Summon the shadow guard," he commanded, his voice no longer human, but a low, resonant sound of breaking ice and falling stone. "Seal the borders. I want every tracker, every scout, every asset we have in the human lands." "Find her," he paused, the words catching in his throat, tasting of ash and regret. "Find them. Bring them home." The last two words were a whisper, not a command, but an anguished prayer to a god he had long ago ceased to believe in. The hunt had begun. Not for a runaway consort, but for the heart of his kingdom, which was now beating somewhere in the cold, unforgiving wilderness. The first days of freedom were a blur of terror and exhaustion. Ilara moved by night, sleeping in hollow logs and shallow caves during the grey twilight hours. Kale, she had named him. A strong, simple name from her own people. He was a quiet baby, as if he understood the precarity of their existence. His eyes, when they opened, were not the winter night black of his father's, but a deep, stormy grey, flecked with silver. He had Valerus's impossibly fine, dark hair, but her mouth, her chin. A perfect, terrifying fusion of their two worlds. She nursed him, her body aching, her milk a thin but steady comfort. The bread and meat from Lyra were gone within 2 days. Hunger became a constant, gnawing companion. She foraged for berries she recognized, dug for roots with her bare, bleeding fingers. She was becoming a wild thing, her fine palace gowns replaced by the rough, stained tunic, her skin scratched and bruised, her hair a tangled mess. But when she looked at Kale, sleeping in his sling against her chest, his small face peaceful, she felt a strength she had never known she possessed. This was real. The dirt under her nails, the ache in her back, the fierce, protective love that burned in her chest, this was more real than any silk sheet or diamond necklace. She was being hunted, she knew that with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. Twice, she saw them, dark, fleeting shapes on a distant ridge, moving with unnatural speed. Valerus's shadow guard. The most elite trackers in the Nocturne Kingdom. They would not tire. They would not need to eat or sleep. They would simply come. She pushed herself harder, her fear a spur. She traveled through dense, pathless forests, waded through icy streams to cover her scent, her every instinct screaming for survival. Meanwhile, Valerus tore his own kingdom apart looking for her. He was a storm of focused, silent fury. He had personally interrogated old Thomas, his mental probes stripping the old vampire's mind bare in seconds, revealing only the pathetic, muddled image of a hooded servant. He had moved on to the kitchens, to the entire servant class. His rage was so potent, so absolute, that ancient vampires who had faced down armies trembled in his presence. He found the girl, Lyra. She stood before him, small and terrified, but her jaw was set. She was kind, Lyra said, her voice shaking but unbroken. She was dying here. You were all killing her, with your whispers and your silence. You, most of all, my king. For her honesty, he did not kill her. He did not even punish her. He simply looked at her, and for the first time, one of his subjects saw not a king, but a man hollowed out by regret. He exiled her from the court, sending her to a remote, quiet outpost where she would be safe from the court's retribution. It was the closest he could come to a gesture of gratitude. He took to the field himself. He left the sycophants and schemers of his court behind, a silent promise of a reckoning to come upon his return. With him were only his 5 most trusted shadow guard, vampires so old their own names were dust, their skills legendary. They moved through the human lands like ghosts. He breathed in the scent of the world Alara now inhabited, damp earth, pine needles, wood smoke. He found the ashes of her first campfire, the remnants of a meal of foraged roots. The signs of her struggle, of her desperation, were like knives in his soul. He began to see the world through her eyes. Every shadow was a threat. Every sound a potential enemy. This was the world he had thrown her into. He, who had legions and ancient power, had never known a moment of true fear in his long life. She, who had nothing but her own courage, was living in a state of constant terror. And she was doing it to protect their son. His son. The thought was still a source of both agony and wonder. He found one of her footprints by a stream bed. It was small, delicate, and next to it, the imprint in the mud was deeper, heavier on one side. She was carrying the child. The physical reality of it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He knelt, his fingers tracing the shape of her foot in the cold mud. How had he been so blind? He had been so consumed with the grand scale of his kingdom, with the eternal dance of power and politics, that he had missed the quiet, miraculous, terrifying truth that had been unfolding in his own home. He had looked at her, but he had not seen her. He remembered a conversation they'd had, months ago. She had been looking at a tapestry depicting one of his ancestors, a fierce vampire queen leading a charge into battle. It must be lonely, she had said softly, to be so powerful that no one dares to tell you the truth. He had dismissed it as a naive, human sentiment. Now, the words echoed in his mind, a condemnation. His loneliness was a fortress of his own making, and its walls had been so high he hadn't even noticed her starving to death inside them. The hunt was no longer about retrieval. It was not about reclaiming what was his. It became a pilgrimage. A journey into the heart of his own failure. With every mile he tracked her, with every sign of her hardship he discovered, a piece of the cold, arrogant king chipped away, revealing something older, something more vulnerable beneath. He followed her trail not with the fury of a king, but with the aching desperation of a man who has lost his whole world and is just beginning to understand it was his own fault. Alara found a temporary haven in a remote, abandoned woodsman's hut. It was little more than 4 crumbling walls and a leaky roof, but it had a hearth and offered shelter from the biting wind. For a week, she and Kale knew a fragile peace. She learned the rhythms of the forest, the patterns of the game animals. She set snares, catching a rabbit, the first real meat she'd had in weeks. She patched the roof with moss and leaves, banked the fire at night to keep them warm. She would sing to Kale, soft, forgotten lullabies from her own childhood. In the quiet moments, watching him sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling, she felt a fierce, uncomplicated joy. This was a life. It was hard and dangerous and uncertain, but it was theirs. It was a life free from the weight of judgment, from the soul-crushing silence. Here, her humanity was not a weakness, it was her strength. It was what allowed her to find food, to make shelter, to feel the sun on her face during the precious hours of dawn and dusk when she dared to be outside. She was beginning to feel like a person again, not a possession. But the peace was an illusion. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, she saw him. Not a tracker, not a guard. Valerus. He stood at the edge of the clearing, as still as the ancient stones around him. He was not wearing his royal finery, but simple, dark traveling leathers. He looked leaner, harder, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that she had never seen before. He was not a king surveying his domain. He was a wolf that had tracked its lost mate across the world. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She snatched Kale from his makeshift cot, holding him tight against her chest as if her body alone could shield him from the immense, ancient power that radiated from his father. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against Kale's sleeping form. This was it. The end of her brief, desperate freedom. He did not move. He simply watched her, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the small bundle in her arms. His face was a mask of unreadable emotions, but his eyes were filled with a raw, aching sorrow that stunned her into stillness. There was no anger there. No possessive fury. Only a vast, desolate grief. He took a single, slow step forward. Ilara, he said. Her name. He had not spoken her name in months. It had always been my lady or a formal, royal. You hearing it now, in his low, resonant voice, was a shock that went through her like a physical blow. Stay back, she whispered, her voice trembling. She took a step back, her bare foot hitting the cold, earthen floor of the hut. Kale stirred in her arms, letting out a small, questioning cry. At the sound, something in Valerus's composure fractured. His shoulders slumped, a barely perceptible movement, but for a being of his immense control, it was like watching a mountain crumble. He is real, he breathed, the words more air than sound. It wasn't a question. It was a revelation. An admission of his own profound blindness. He raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. The king of the nocturne, the master of 1,000 legions, was surrendering. Not to an army, but to a terrified woman and the infant in her arms. I will not harm you, he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't name. Either of you. I swear it on my immortal life. She watched him, her fear warring with a flicker of something else, something she had thought long dead. The memory of the man who had traced her jaw with such tenderness. The man she had foolishly, hopelessly, begun to love. The silence stretched between them, but this was a new kind of silence. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of everything unspoken, everything that had been broken, and the fragile, terrifying possibility of what might come next. The standoff in the clearing held the weight of a century. Time stretched, thin and brittle, measured by the frantic beat of Ilara's heart and the slow, steady rise and fall of Kale's chest. Valerus remained where he was, a statue carved from shadow and regret, his open hands a testament to a power he had finally learned not to wield. He was letting her choose. The silence, for the first time, was his gift to her, not his weapon against her. Why? The word was a croak, torn from her throat. It was too small a word for the chasm of her pain, for the months of humiliation, for the terror of her flight. But it was the only word she had. Why did you let them? He did not look away. He met her gaze and absorbed the full force of her anguish. There was no flicker of royal arrogance, no hint of justification. There was only the stark, ugly truth. Because I was a coward, he said, and the admission seemed to cost him more than any physical blow ever could. I have ruled for 2,000 years, Ilara. I have faced armies, ancient beasts, the machinations of gods and demons. But I did not know how to face you. He took another slow step. I saw your light, your warmth, your fragile, fleeting humanity. It was terrifying. I thought if I touched it, I would break it. If I brought you too close to me, my world would extinguish you. So I held you at a distance. I thought my silence, my detachment, was a shield. I thought the court would see you as mine and that would be enough. His voice dropped to a whisper, laced with self-loathing. I did not realize that to them, my silence was not a shield. It was permission. It was a declaration that you were nothing to me. Ilara flinched as if he'd struck her. That was it. That was the truth that had festered in her soul. He had declared her nothing. And the court, his loyal, vicious court, had acted accordingly. Tears she had refused to shed for months burned behind her eyes. They stripped me of my name, she said, her voice gaining a tremor of strength. They made me invisible. I would walk into a room and conversations would stop. They would look through me as if I were glass. They spilled wine on my gowns and called it an accident. They whispered that my human stench offended the king's senses. And you just sat there. I know, he said. His face was etched with a pain so profound it seemed to age him, to crack the perfect, immortal mask. I saw it. I heard it. And I told myself it was a test. That you needed to become strong enough to endure them. That you needed to earn your place. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of utter defeat. The arrogance of it. You owed us nothing. We owed you everything. You were carrying the future of my line, and I let my pride, my fear, my abysmal ignorance, put you both in mortal danger. He looked at Kale, who had begun to fuss, his little face scrunching up. The infant's distress seemed to pierce Valeru's directly. May I, he began, then stopped, as if realizing he had no right to ask for anything. May I see him? Ilara hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide her son from this world, from this man who was both his father and a stranger. But the raw, unvarnished vulnerability in Valeru's eyes held her captive. This was not the king. This was a father seeing his child for the first time. Slowly, cautiously, she lowered the sling from her shoulder, turning Kale so Valerus could see his face. Valerus moved closer, his movements unnaturally slow, as if afraid a sudden gesture might shatter the fragile moment. He knelt in the dirt and damp leaves, the king of the nocturne on his knees before his outcast family. He didn't reach out. He just looked. He drank in the sight of his son, the dusting of dark hair, the tiny, perfect ears, the stormy grey eyes that were blinking up at him. A sound escaped his throat, a choked, guttural noise of awe and agony. He has your eyes, Ilara whispered, not knowing why she said it. No, Valerus corrected, his voice thick. He has my mother's eyes. I have not seen them in 3 millennia. He finally looked up at her, and the tears he could not shed were present in the glistening torment of his gaze. He is the first pure thing in my life since she died. And I almost lost him before I ever knew him. He finally extended a hand, not toward the baby, but toward her. His long, elegant fingers were trembling. Ilara, I cannot erase the past. I cannot unwound the cruelty you have endured. It is a stain on my honor, on my soul, that will never wash away. But I am asking you, not to forgive me. It is too soon. It may always be too soon. I am asking for a chance. A chance to be the man you deserved from the beginning. A chance to be a father to our son. His plea hung in the air between them. It was not a demand. It was not a command. It was a supplication. He was placing his future, the future of his kingdom, entirely in her hands. He was giving her back the power his court had stolen. The power to choose. She looked from his anguished face to the sleeping face of her son. The world she had escaped to was harsh and unforgiving. She could survive here, perhaps. But could Kale thrive? He was half vampire, a being of 2 worlds. He would need more than foraged roots and a leaky hut. He would need his father. He would need to understand the part of himself that was ancient and powerful and of the night. But she would not go back to the obsidian palace. Not to that gilded cage filled with vipers. I will not go back there, she said, her voice firm, the last of her fear burning away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I will not have my son grow up in a place where his mother is seen as less than dust. I will not have him learn contempt from your court. Nor will I, Valerus said without hesitation. That court is broken. I broke it with my neglect. When we return, if you choose for us to return, it will not be to the palace you knew. I will tear it down to the foundation if I have to. I will purge the vipers. I will build a world that is worthy of you both. He looked at Kale again, and a fierce, protective light entered his eyes. They will kneel to you, Ilara. Not out of fear of me, but out of respect for the queen who bore the future. I will make them see you. This was the promise she had longed for. Not of jewels or power, but of being seen. Of being valued. It was a promise of a new world, a world he would have to build from the ashes of the old one. The journey would be long. The wounds were deep. But looking at him, kneeling in the dirt, stripped of all his power except the power of his regret, she saw not the king who had betrayed her, but the man who was willing to burn down his world to win her back. Slowly, her hand still clutching Kale protectively, she took a single step forward. It was not a surrender. It was a new beginning. An armistice in a war she had never wanted to fight. A first, tentative step onto a bridge he was building across the chasm of his own making. They did not return to the Nocturne Kingdom for another month. Valerus sent his shadow guard away with a single, curt command to await his return at the border. He stayed with her in the woodsman's hut, a king living as a commoner. It was a strange, delicate time, a period of careful negotiation over the wreckage of their past. He did not touch her, did not presume any intimacy. He gave her space, both physical and emotional, respecting the boundaries she had been forced to draw. He learned, for the first time, the simple, profound rhythms of a mortal life. He watched her tend to Kale, his expression a mixture of fascination and heartbreaking sadness for all he had missed. He learned the specific pitch of Kale's cry when he was hungry versus when he was tired. He saw the fierce, unyielding love in Alara's eyes as she nursed their son, and he understood that this love was a force more powerful than any army he had ever commanded. He provided for them. He would disappear into the forest at dusk and return with firewood that would last for days, or with a deer, cleanly and respectfully killed. He repaired the leaky roof, his ancient power used not for conquest, but for the simple, domestic act of providing shelter. He would sit for hours by the fire, simply watching them, his silence no longer one of neglect, but of reverent observation. One evening, Kale was crying, a wail of discomfort that Alara couldn't soothe. She had fed him, changed him, walked with him, but his distress only grew. Valerus, who had kept a respectful distance, moved to her side. "May I?" he asked softly. Hesitantly, she passed their son into his arms. It was the first time he had held him. Valerus was clumsy at first, his large hands looking impossibly huge against the baby's tiny form. But he was gentle. He held Kale against his chest, and the baby, who should have been terrified of this cold, strange creature, quieted almost instantly. He seemed to recognize something, some deep, primal connection to the steady, slow beat of his father's living heart. Kale settled, his little head resting on Valerus's shoulder, and fell asleep. Valerus stood frozen, holding his sleeping son, a look of profound, shattering awe on his face. He looked at Alara over Kale's head, his eyes communicating more than words ever could. "Thank you. He is everything. You are everything." In that moment, something in Alara's heart, a part she thought had been frozen solid, began to thaw. She saw the future. Not an easy one, but a possible one. When they finally crossed the border back into the Nocturne Kingdom, it was on her terms. They did not go to the capital. Instead, Valerus took them to a quiet, secluded castle in the northern mountains, a place of soaring silver spires and ancient forests. It was his private retreat, a place no courtier had ever been permitted to enter. "This will be our home," he told her. "For now. Until the capital is cleansed." The cleansing began the next day. He did not ride to the Obsidian Palace in a fury. He sent a single decree. The entire court was to be disbanded. Their titles, their lands, their privileges were suspended. Every single member, from the highest lord to the lowest functionary, was to present themselves for a personal audience with the king. One by one. For weeks, the lords and ladies of the night came. They expected to flatter their way back into his good graces. They found not their indulgent, detached king, but an implacable judge. He did not need to ask them what they had done. He knew. He had had months to reflect, to remember every slight, every whispered insult, every act of cruelty. Lady Seraphina, who had been so sure of her ascension, was the first. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at her and said, "You sought to poison the roots of my family. You will now learn what it is to have nothing." He stripped her of her name and her ancient bloodline's holdings, exiling her to the farthest, most desolate corner of his kingdom, to live out her immortality in shame and solitude. He went down the line. Those who had been most cruel were exiled. Those who had been complicit in their silence were stripped of rank and sent to serve in the harshest border garrisons. He tore down the entire social structure of his kingdom, a structure that had stood for millennia, because it had failed the one test that mattered. It had failed to be a place where his family could be safe. He was not just punishing them for their cruelty to Alara, he was punishing them for his own. They were the instruments of his neglect, and he was breaking them. News of the king's purge spread like wildfire. They called him the Mad King, the King of Ruin. But a new order began to rise from the ashes. He elevated those from the lower classes, those who had shown kindness, those whose loyalty was not to power but to principle. He promoted the captain of the guard who had once offered Elara a cloak on a cold night. He granted lands and title to Lyra's family. He was building a new court, a new nobility, based not on ancient blood, but on character. During this time, Elara and Kael lived in peace. She watched the changes from afar, Valerus telling her everything in the quiet evenings. He was rebuilding his world for her. For them. He was keeping his promise. He began to smile, a small, hesitant expression at first, but it grew more frequent as he spent time with his son. He would let Kael's tiny hand wrap around his finger, a look of quiet wonder on his face. He and Elara began to talk, truly talk. She told him of her childhood, of the sun and the sea. He told her of his long, lonely life, of the weight of immortality. They were two strangers from different worlds, slowly, carefully, learning each other's language. 6 months after their return, he came to her in the garden. Kael was sleeping nearby in a basket, bathed in the soft, grey light of the eternal twilight. Valerus held out his hand. In his palm lay a new ring, a simple band of silver, but coiled around it was a tiny, sleeping dragon, its scales made of crushed obsidian. "I am not asking you to be my consort," he said, his voice steady and quiet. "I am not asking you to be a figurehead. I am asking you to be my queen. To rule beside me. To be my conscience, my heart, and my strength. To help me build a kingdom where our son will never know the cruelty his mother endured." Elara looked at the ring, then up at his face. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a clear, steady devotion. The silence between them now was no longer a chasm, but a comfortable, shared space. It was the silence of understanding. The silence of home. She placed her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "Yes," she said. The coronation was unlike any the Nocturne Kingdom had ever seen. It took place not in the oppressive grandeur of the old throne room, but in an open-air amphitheater under the stars. The new court was there, a mix of ancient vampires and newly elevated commoners. When Valerus placed the crown on Elara's head, he did not call for the court to bow. He knelt. The king of the Nocturne Kingdom, in front of his entire world, knelt before his human queen. And one by one, the new court followed, kneeling not in fear, but in genuine reverence for the woman who had, by her quiet courage, saved their kingdom from its own cold heart. Elara, holding her son, the Prince Kael, looked at her husband, her king, and knew that the silence had finally been broken, replaced by the sound of a world being remade. The years that followed were a testament to that promise. The reign of King Valerus and Queen Elara became a new legend, a story told in hushed, reverent tones. The Obsidian Palace, once a monument to cold ambition, was transformed. Elara, with Valerus's full support, brought life into its sterile halls. She cultivated vast indoor gardens, filled with bioluminescent fungi and pale, night-blooming flowers, their scent a soft, living perfume that chased the old ghosts from the corners. Tapestries depicting her human world, sun-drenched fields and turquoise seas, were hung on the walls, a constant reminder of the world beyond their twilight kingdom. Kael grew, a child of two realms, and he was the bridge. He had his father's preternatural grace and strength, but his mother's warmth and empathy. He could move like a shadow, but he laughed with the unrestrained joy of a human child. The court, the new court built on merit and character, adored him. They saw in him not just the future of their line, but the physical embodiment of the balance their kingdom had so desperately needed. He was proof that strength and compassion were not mutually exclusive. Valerus changed in ways even he had not thought possible. The presence of his family thawed the ancient frost in his soul. He learned to delegate, to trust the new court he had built. He spent less time on the throne and more time on the floor of the nursery, patiently helping Kael stack blocks of polished jet, his long, elegant fingers surprisingly deft. He would read to his son from ancient histories, but also from the simple human storybooks Elara had brought with her. He never stopped trying to atone. He knew that the scars on Elara's soul, though faded, would always remain. His atonement was not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, daily acts of seeing her. He learned her favorite foods, the music that made her smile, the moments when she needed solitude. He would often just watch her as she walked through her gardens, a quiet, profound gratitude in his eyes. He had almost lost everything through his blindness, and now he spent his eternity making sure he never missed a single detail of the precious life he had been given back. Their partnership redefined the monarchy. Ilara's human perspective was an invaluable asset. She championed the mortal populations under their rule, ensuring the blood tithes were fair, not predatory. She established schools and hospitals in the human principalities, earning the loyalty and love of a people who had only ever known the vampires as fearsome, distant overlords. Valerus, guided by her wisdom, forged new treaties built on mutual respect rather than fear. The Nocturne Kingdom, once an isolated, feared power, began to prosper in a new era of stability and cautious diplomacy. One anniversary of her escape, a day they never spoke of but both silently acknowledged, he led her to the highest tower of the northern castle. The sky above was a swirl of faint, cosmic nebulae, the only stars their world knew. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked softly, his arm a warm, solid presence around her. "The sun." Ilara was quiet for a long moment, breathing in the cool, clean air. "I miss the memory of it," she said finally. "I miss the idea of it. But the sun I remember was in a world where I was alone. Here," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder, "I have found a different kind of light." He tightened his embrace, his chin resting on the top of her head. He knew the cost of her love, the world she had given up. It was a debt he would spend his immortal life repaying. "I had lived in darkness for so long, I thought it was the only thing that existed," he murmured into her hair. "You and Kale, you are my dawn." As Kale grew from a boy into a young man, he became a diplomat of unparalleled skill. His dual nature allowed him to move seamlessly between the vampire and human worlds. He had his mother's disarming kindness and his father's unshakable authority. He negotiated trade deals, settled ancient disputes, and was beloved by both peoples. He was the living promise of their new world. Ilara never lost her core of inner strength, the steel that had allowed her to survive the court and flee into the wilderness. As queen, she was compassionate but firm. She had a unique ability to see the hidden pain in others, to understand the language of silence and what it concealed. Those who had been marginalized or overlooked in the old regime found a champion in her. She became known as Ilara the Wise, the Sun Queen of the Night. Valerus, in his later centuries, was a king transformed. The cold, detached monarch was a distant memory. He was still powerful, still a fearsome warrior when necessary, but his power was now tempered by a profound wisdom and a deep, abiding love for his family. He ruled with a lighter touch, confident in the kingdom he and Ilara had built together. One evening, as they sat together in their private library, watching a now-grown Kale debate politics with the kingdom's elder advisors, Ilara reached out and took Valerus's hand. Her hand was warm, lined with the faint map of a life fully lived. His was cool and smooth, eternally unchanging. "I was so afraid of you," she confessed quietly, her eyes on their son. "That first year. I thought you were a monster." He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. "I was," he said, his voice devoid of self-pity, a simple statement of fact. "A monster of my own making. Blind and proud. You saved me from myself, Ilara. You walked through the dark and dragged me into the light with you." She smiled, a soft, gentle expression that still, after all these years, made his beating heart ache with love. "We saved each other," she corrected him. They sat in comfortable silence, a silence born not of neglect or fear, but of perfect understanding. It was a silence filled with the weight of a shared history, of trials overcome, of a love that had been forged in darkness and had learned to create its own light. Outside the castle walls, the Nocturne Kingdom rested in its perpetual twilight, but inside, in the hearts of its rulers and the promise of its prince, a new day had long since dawned. The king who had let his court break her had found that in her pieces, he could rebuild not just a woman, not just a family, but an entire world. And it was a world far more beautiful than the one he had known before.